You know what finally broke me? It was a white oak bench. I built it for my back porch, took my time with it, used good lumber, and finished it with one of those premium deck sealants that promised 5 years of protection right on the label. 18 months later, the seat boards were soft and gray, and when I pushed my thumbnail into the end grain, it sank right in, rotted from the inside. I was so frustrated, I almost gave up building anything for outdoors. Then I stumbled across something that stopped me cold. I was reading about the stave churches in Norway, these incredible wooden structures, and I learned that some of them have been standing for over 800 years. 800 years, outside, in one of the harshest climates on Earth. And the only thing protecting that wood is a simple mixture that Norse craftsmen have been using since the Viking Age. 2 ingredients, no chemicals, no plastic film, just a recipe that has been quietly outperforming everything on the hardware store shelf for centuries. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly what that mixture is, how to make it, and how to apply it the way the old Norse builders did. Plus, stick around to the end because I will show you a simple heat trick I picked up that drives this finish deeper into the wood than anything I've ever tried. Let us get into it. What we are talking about today is one of the oldest wood preservation methods in the world, and it is shockingly simple. If you build anything that lives outdoors, furniture, fence posts, garden beds, tool handles, timber frames, this is something you need to understand. Because once you see how it works and why it works, you will never look at a can of deck sealer the same way again. So let me give you some background on where this comes from, because the history is what convinced me this was worth taking seriously. The Norse, the people we loosely call Vikings, were some of the most accomplished woodworkers in the ancient world. They had to be. Wood was their primary building material for everything: ships, homes, storage buildings, churches. And they were working in Scandinavia, where the winters are brutal, the air is wet, and wood rot is a constant threat. If your longship fell apart mid-voyage in the North Atlantic, you were dead. If your food storehouse rotted through before spring, your family starved. Wood preservation was not a hobby for these people. It was survival. And the method they developed was beautifully simple. They learned that if you take pine tar, rendered slowly from the stumps and roots of pine trees, and combine it with raw linseed oil pressed from flaxseed, you get a mixture that does not just sit on the surface of the wood. It soaks deep into the fibers and essentially becomes part of the wood itself. The stave churches at Borgund and Ornes in Norway are the living proof. Borgund was built around 1180, and it is still standing. The timber is still sound, and it has been maintained with the same pine tar recipe for its entire life. That is not marketing. That is 840 years of evidence standing in the rain. Now, before I show you the recipe, I want you to understand why most modern finishes fail on outdoor wood, because this is what made the Norse approach click for me. Most deck sealants, exterior varnishes, and even the so-called waterproofing stains you find at the hardware store work by forming a film on the surface of the wood. Think of it like wrapping the board in a thin plastic bag. At first, it looks great. Water beads up, the color pops, and you feel like you have done right by that lumber. But here is the problem. That film is never perfect. It develops micro cracks from UV exposure and seasonal movement. Water gets in through those tiny openings, and then it gets trapped underneath the film, where it cannot evaporate. Now you have moisture sitting against the wood fibers with no way out, and that is the exact condition that rot fungi need to thrive. So the very thing you applied to protect the wood is actually creating the environment that destroys it. I wish someone had explained that to me 20 years ago. The Norse approach is fundamentally different. Instead of trapping moisture out, it fills the wood cells from the inside, so there is no room for moisture to accumulate in the first place. It is not a barrier. It is a replacement. That distinction changes everything. All right, let me walk you through the 2 ingredients and why each one matters. The first is pine tar. Real pine tar, sometimes called Stockholm tar, because Sweden was the largest producer for centuries. This is not the coal tar you find in some roofing products. Pine tar is made by slowly burning pine stumps and root wood in a kiln or covered pit with very limited oxygen. The resin and oils render out of the wood and collect as a thick, dark, sticky liquid that smells like a campfire mixed with a forest floor. It is one of the oldest manufactured substances in human history. Pine tar is naturally antifungal and antimicrobial. It repels water, but remains slightly flexible, so it moves with the wood instead of cracking. And because it comes from wood itself, it has a natural affinity for wood fibers. It wants to soak in. The second ingredient is raw linseed oil, and I want to stress the word raw here. Do not use boiled linseed oil for this recipe. Boiled linseed oil contains metallic drying agents that cause it to harden into a film, which is exactly the problem we are trying to avoid. Raw linseed oil stays flexible. It penetrates deeper. It cures slowly by oxidation over days and weeks, which gives it time to work its way into the cell structure. You can find genuine pine tar from Scandinavian suppliers online. Look for 100% wood tar with no additives. For the linseed oil, cold-pressed raw flax oil is ideal. You can source both for around $30 to $40 total, and that is enough to treat a significant amount of lumber. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. Now here is the part you have been waiting for. The traditional mixing ratio that Norse builders used and that Scandinavian craftsmen still use today on historic structures is roughly equal parts pine tar and raw linseed oil, 1-to-1 by volume. Some traditional recipes go as high as 2 parts pine tar to 1 part linseed oil for maximum weather resistance, and others lean toward 1 part pine tar to 2 parts linseed oil for easier penetration on dense hardwoods. But the classic starting point is 50-50, and that is what I would recommend for your first batch. Here is how to prepare it. Pour your pine tar and raw linseed oil into a metal container. Do not use plastic because the pine tar will attack certain plastics. A clean steel paint can work perfectly. Now, and this is critical, you need to warm the mixture gently before applying it. The Norse did this over open fires. You can do it with a double boiler setup, or by setting your metal container in a larger pot of hot water on a camp stove or hot plate outdoors. You want the mixture warm to the touch, roughly 100 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Not boiling, not simmering, just warm enough that it thins out and flows easily. When it is ready, it should have the consistency of warm honey and pour in a smooth, steady stream. If it is still thick and sluggish, give it more time to warm. For application, the Norse method is generous. They did not brush on a thin coat and walk away. They flooded the surface. Use a natural bristle brush or even a rag and lay the mixture on thick, working it into the grain. Pay special attention to end grain because that is where moisture enters fastest and where this treatment does its best work. Let the first coat soak in for at least 30 minutes, then apply a second coat while the first is still tacky. On soft woods like pine, spruce, or cedar, 2 heavy coats are usually enough. On denser species like oak, you may want 3 coats with an hour between each. Here is a detail that makes a real difference. Apply the mixture to warm, dry wood. If you can let your lumber sit in direct sunlight for an hour before you start, the heat opens the pores and dramatically increases absorption. I have tested this side by side, warm wood versus room temperature wood, and the warm boards absorb almost twice as much mixture on the first coat. The Norse knew this instinctively. They applied their tar in the summer months when the sun and the wood were both warm. Once I understood the application method, the next question I had was, why does this actually prevent rot at a level that modern products cannot match? And the answer comes down to what is happening inside the wood at a cellular level. When you flood a board with warm pine tar and linseed oil, the mixture is thin enough to enter the open cell structures in the wood, the tiny tube-like vessels that once carried water and nutrients when the tree was alive. As the mixture cools and the linseed oil slowly cures through oxidation over the following weeks, it fills and lines those cells from the inside. Moisture cannot accumulate because the space is already occupied. And rot fungi, which need a moisture content above roughly 20% to colonize wood, simply cannot get established. This is fundamentally different from pressure-treated lumber, which uses chemical toxins to poison the fungi. Those chemicals leach out over time, which is why pressure-treated boards still rot eventually, especially the heartwood that the chemicals never reached. The Norse method does not poison anything. It simply removes the conditions that rot needs to survive. And because pine tar itself is mildly antifungal, you get a secondary layer of protection on top of the physical moisture displacement. The Scandinavians who maintain the staved churches today report that timbers treated consistently with this mixture show virtually no decay, even in joints and crevices where water pools. For maintenance, the beauty of this system is its simplicity. You do not need to strip the old finish before reapplying. There is no film to scrape or sand off. When the surface starts to look dry and thirsty, usually every 3 to 5 years depending on exposure, you simply warm up another batch and brush on a fresh coat right over the existing treatment. Each application feeds deeper into the wood and builds on the previous treatment. The finish actually improves with age, becoming richer and more weather-resistant over time. Compare that to modern sealants, where maintenance means stripping, sanding, and starting over every 2 to 3 years. For modern applications, this mixture is outstanding on any outdoor softwood project. Garden furniture, deck boards, pergola posts, raised bed frames, fence pickets, gate frames, tool handles, sawhorses, anything that lives outside. It works beautifully on pine, spruce, fir, cedar, and larch. It also works on oak and other hardwoods, though you will need thinner coats and more patience. Where I would not use it is on indoor furniture or surfaces that contact food, because pine tar has a strong smoky smell that takes weeks to mellow outdoors and would be overwhelming inside. And it does darken the wood significantly, so if you want to preserve a light natural color, this is not your finish. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that this tradition handles completely differently. The first one is reaching for a film-forming sealer by default. I did this for decades because that is what the hardware store sells, and the label says it works. But every film-forming finish I have ever used on outdoor wood has eventually peeled, cracked, or trapped moisture. The Norse approach skips the film entirely and goes straight into the wood. The second pattern is recoating without stripping. With modern finishes, if you just slap a new coat over a failing old coat, you are sealing in the problem. With pine tar and linseed oil, recoating over the old treatment is not just acceptable, it is the intended maintenance method. There is nothing to trap. The third pattern is using boiled linseed oil because it dries faster. I did this for years, but the drying agents in boiled linseed oil cause it to cure into a harder film that sits closer to the surface. Raw linseed oil cures more slowly, but penetrates much deeper and stays flexible for the life of the wood. The fourth pattern is ignoring end grain. Most of us apply finish to the faces and edges of a board and barely touch the ends. The Norse treated end grain first and most heavily because they understood that end grain is the highway for moisture entering the wood. Seal the ends and you have solved half the problem before you even touch the faces. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I stumbled onto while experimenting with this finish on some thick white oak fence posts, and it made a noticeable difference. After applying your first coat of the warm pine tar and linseed oil mixture, take a standard propane torch, the kind you would use for sweating copper pipe, and pass the flame slowly over the wet surface at a distance of about 8 to 10 inches. Do not scorch the wood. You are not trying to char it. You are just adding enough heat to thin the mixture further, right there on the surface, and drive it deeper into the grain. You will actually see the finish sink into the wood in front of the flame. It is remarkable to watch. I treated 2 identical posts side by side, one with the torch pass and one without. And after a year of exposure, the torch-treated post was noticeably harder and more weather-resistant at the surface. Just be careful, work outdoors, keep the flame moving, and have a fire extinguisher nearby because linseed oil is combustible. But this one trick dramatically increased penetration depth on heavy timbers. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now, or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. You know, what strikes me most about this whole method is how simple it is. 2 ingredients. A warm pot, a brush. No chemistry degree, no expensive products, no proprietary formulas. Just pine tar and linseed oil, the same recipe that kept longships crossing the North Atlantic and kept stave churches standing through nearly a millennium of Scandinavian winters. Sometimes the old ways survive because they actually work better than anything we have come up with since. Try this on your next outdoor project, even just a scrapboard left out in the weather as a test piece, and see for yourself what 800 years of proof looks like. I think you will be as impressed as I was. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.